Really quickly, I just want to go through some quick housekeeping, and then I will go back through and tell us a little bit more about an overview of TourWest. For those of you who have joined the webinar in the past, this was the only webinar that we had offered, was the overview of TourWest. So I just also wanted to note really quickly that we're going to have a second part this year as well. We have decided that there's some pieces that we never get a chance to focus on in this webinar, and that has to do with kind of pro tips and tech FAQs and or assistance. So in other words, what makes a strong application, how to upload your media sample, those sorts of questions. Please join us for that. Other things to note is there have been some changes to the application site, both on the front end with the eligibility. None of the eligibility requirements have been changed. We just tried to streamline everything. I will also indicate to you that some of the questions in the narrative section have changed quite a bit. They all address the same topics. However, we have updated them in a way that we hope will be most helpful and clear as it pertains to the goals of this grant. I want to introduce one person. You'll see on this that Lonnie Morris, who is not me, is the grants coordinator for WESTAF. Lonnie is on the call, and Lonnie, if you'll unmute yourself, can you say hello to everybody?
Hello, everyone. I'm Lonnie. I'm the grants coordinator with WESTAF. I recently transitioned into this role. So Madalena is being wonderful and leading this session with you all today, and she's still training me. And so I will be leading future sessions, but today I'm just going to join with the rest of you.
Thanks, Lonnie. So as Lonnie mentioned, she's in a period of transition. She already has really gotten a sense of our grant programs, and she is super helpful. Please direct all your questions to Lonnie at TourWest@westaf.org, and we'll have that information later on in the grant. And again, I'm Madalena Salazar. I have been the TourWest grant manager for the past few years, but I have transitioned into the role of social responsibility and inclusion consultant for WESTAF. Really quickly, what is WESTAF? WESTAF is the overarching organization that services or manages the TourWest grant. WESTAF is the Western States Arts Federation. It's based in Denver, Colorado. It is one of the 6 regional arts organizations in the United States. So that's essentially the go-between between your state's arts agencies at the state level and our federal arts agency, the National Endowment for the Arts. Speaking of the National Endowment for the Arts, the TourWest grant is National Endowment for the Arts pass-through fund. All federal funding that passes through WESTAF, we spread it out to all of our states because we have a little bit of a better connection to all of the folks in our region. And that region is the 13 states in the West that consist of New Mexico north to Montana and all the way west, which includes Alaska and Hawaii. What is TourWest? As I mentioned, it's an NEA pass-through grant. It has been going on for over 25 years now, and it helps to support nonprofit arts organizations, community organizations, and sometimes municipalities, as well as schools and universities, to support high-quality performing art for the most underserved communities in our region. So the presenting organization, it is the entity that will apply for the TourWest grant, but the grant itself helps to cover the artistic fees for the performing artist. So it doesn't cover travel, it doesn't cover, any of the expenses related to the performance other than the artistic fees. And that covers 50% of the artistic fees up to $2,500, whichever is less. In other words, if your artistic fee is $4,000, the maximum award amount that you could receive is $2,000. If your artistic fee, is $5,000 or above, the maximum amount you could receive is $2,500, regardless of whether it's $5,000 or $25,000. So in other words, there does need to be a match there on the presenter side. We do hope that this will help to alleviate some of the other costs of the production. And we also are very encouraged to know that out of the approximately 300 presenters that apply every year, we award the majority of those, and we do try to award at least a good substance of the asked for amount or the maximum eligible amount. Speaking of what it covers, we also, through this grant, generally speaking, from year to year, it sometimes grows and sometimes shrinks depending on the federal budget. But generally speaking, every year we award about $500,000 in funding to arts organizations throughout the West with this grant. Okay, so moving into the goals of this grant. The first goal of the TourWest grant I somewhat alluded to, and that is a wide distribution of this federal funding throughout the Western states. As I mentioned, this funding is coming from the National Endowment for the Arts. Well, what does that really mean? That means that it's actually your taxpayer dollars at work. So it's very important to us as a regional arts organization and our partners in the state's arts organization, as well as the National Endowment for the Arts, that you are able to receive your taxpayer funding back to support this high quality performing arts experience. We try and we believe we do try to get to some of the most remote and underserved communities in the Western states. And we do try to ensure when it comes to paneling, as well as when it comes to awarding the grants, that each state is quite evenly distributed. So if you know of a presenter in your community that has not applied for TourWest but seems eligible, I would highly encourage you to share this information with them, because we do encourage as many presenters in all of the reaches of the Western region to apply for this grant. So our second goal is really to bring high quality performing arts to the most underserved audiences throughout the Western states. And sometimes, as I mentioned before, that has to do with your location. It has to do with the fact that you are very remote, very rural. We know that that is a large part of our region. That said, we are also looking at underserved communities in a number of different ways. And this is a very key and important part of the goals of this TourWest grant. We want to ensure that those communities that are the most underserved economically, for example, you can express that your community is highly underserved because of the fact that it has many Title I schools, or the economy has been in a long-term slump. You can describe your underserved need around some of those economic challenges. You could be geographically underserved. Maybe you're a rural community that, in addition, is very difficult to get to because of the terrain. We all know what it's like in the Western states. We have very erratic weather. We have the Rocky Mountains cutting through the majority of us. You can be even in places like Hawaii. We know that Hawaii is the most remote location on Earth in comparison to other land masses. Related to that, you may be underserved by high quality performing arts, or just underserved by education and arts in general. Perhaps your schools have all had to cut their arts programs. Perhaps you don't have too many performing arts centers or arts centers in general. Maybe, in other words, your communities are very limited on resources and exposure. And that's another underserved need. Now, I will add, there are kind of arguments towards which communities can be the most underserved, and our panelists will continue to look at that as well. Of course, there's also communities in our region that are ethnically, racially, and linguistically underserved, for example, maybe refugee and immigrant communities, for example. So those are also key community demographics that we understand to be underserved in our region. Of course, we also recognize that many of those communities experience, are kind of underserved in intersectional ways. So they may be refugee communities of color that have limited English capacity and also are living in a rural area. When you're describing your community, please give us a full picture of that so that the panelists can really assess what your community looks like, the community that you are serving with your organization, and the community that you are serving with this particular project. We mentioned high quality performing art. When we say that, it is it's a very weighty question in our assessment, the quality of the performing art. Now, I recognize, just as probably most everybody does, that this is a very subjective assessment. And so therefore, it's up to you as an applicant to make that argument for us of what high quality performing arts is to your community, to your organization, and also, what the broader arts community feels about this artist. We judge it by merit and not necessarily quality because, again, that's a bit subjective. So I will use the words merit and quality interchangeably, but generally speaking, we will word it as merit. And again, as I mentioned, this is a really important piece to speak to throughout the narrative of your grant application, but it is something that we ask for you to kind of paint a picture for us because it can be subjective. There are some potentially objective aspects of artistic merit. For example, the years of experience an artist has, their professionalism. It is important that you also kind of speak to their accolades, speak to their experience, potentially their training, any other awards or, significant pieces that you feel that the panelists should know about when it comes to these artists. Please also speak to their relevance for your organization, for your organization's mission, for your community, because it's my opinion, and I believe it's generally the opinion of our panelists, that it doesn't really matter the accolades and the awards and the experience an artist has if they are not genuinely connecting with the needs of your organization and with your community. And so please do also describe why these artists are important to you and why they're of merit to you. And then next goal is also a key component, kind of related to this underserved element, also a little bit related to artistic merit. And so that's why, just a quick pro tip, it's important for you to recall that all of the questions in the narrative are somewhat related to each other. And while we ask individual questions in the application, it's always helpful to kind of refer back or to continue your justification or proposal throughout each of the questions because it's hard to parse them apart oftentimes. So goal number 3 is to facilitate communication and collaboration among artists, their managers and or agents, presenters, and communities. So kind of basic point for presenters is collaboration can often look like block booking with presenters in your area. We see that as one way of collaboration. You have to work with the artists and their management to be able to do that, but presenters also have to collaborate with each other to see, what best serves the communities in their general area, and that it is also best serving the organization's bottom line, as well as it's getting great opportunities for the artists. So that is something that traditionally we have always looked towards as a positive, and there's kind of bonus scoring for that as well. In addition to that, it's always important that the presenters are collaborating with the audiences which they hope to serve. That could mean that you are collaborating with community organizations in a target underserved audience. It can also mean that working with those organizations to shape what the outreach is going to look like. You are doing audience assessments to get a better picture of what your audience needs and is looking for. So collaboration in terms of program development, project development, as well as just a general understanding of the needs of your audience and the needs of your community. It's always great to know when the artists are also collaborating with artists in their community through outreach if possible. So the lists that we have here on this slide are just some examples of what we're looking for when we are talking about communication and collaboration. Speaking on behalf of the panelists in general, there's an appreciation for recognizing the fact that presenters that are applying for this grant are really deeply engaging with artists in the field, with other presenters, and also with their communities and audiences. And then fourth goal is audience development. This is a key component, as well as a piece of the eligibility criteria. TourWest is focused around audience development and audience engagement. So through the TourWest grant, we are looking more for projects that help build new audience or engage deeply with audiences where you may not have the best relationship, or whether you're deepening that relationship with an audience that you do have. It's important to note that we, there are some kind of built-in audiences for particular performers or performances. And so if you are going to be having the Night Before Christmas staged, typically has, or the Nutcracker, for example, or a Broadway show, those tend to have built-in audiences, despite the fact that they may be high-quality performing arts, despite the fact that you may have deep audience or strong educational outreach to go along with it. The fact is that it's not really deepening your engagement or building audience. So we're looking for projects that maybe doing something a little bit new, or offering something a little bit new or different to your community, or supporting artists and programs that, maybe your community wouldn't necessarily immediately flock to, but that is really important, the exposure of these artists to your community. Finally, I kind of spoke to many of these points, but the qualifications and eligibility for the TourWest grant. Some of the eligibility qualifications, is first of all, the presenting organization has to be a nonprofit performing arts organization or the equivalent. Just a note, when we say the equivalent, what we mean by that is a municipality, a school, a university, another entity that operates in a non-taxable way that is similar to a nonprofit, but may not hold a 501c3. So you either have to be a 501c3 nonprofit or an equivalent organization that is still not taxed. Secondly, we already spoke to the performing arts aspect as well as the merit. I do want to speak to a couple points around the performing artists. Sometimes you will hear us say performing and literary artists. When we say literary artists, I have some caveats there, and that is because those literary artists that we can fund through this grant must be presenting a show that is performative. So in other words, it should be something like a storyteller or a slam poet or some sort of literary artist that is on the more performative side. So if you feel like there's a bit of a gray area when it comes to that literary artist, please reach out to us. We could probably tell you that if it is a writer that is reading from their new publication, that is not going to be eligible. If it is a storyteller and you have, and they do something that's, I don't know, particularly special, or if you have some confusion about that, please do reach out to us. But the general rule is if it's a performative literary artist, then it should qualify. Other quote unquote performing artists, I should say, those that are more on the entertainment value side of things are also ineligible. So when I say entertainment, this again is not our definition, but the definition of the National Endowment for the Arts, which really wants to emphasize quote unquote fine arts element per se. So entertainment acts that are ineligible for funding are, for example, stand-up comedians, magicians or illusionists, acrobatic shows. Those are kind of typically the artists that we cannot fund through this. because they are considered more entertainment acts and oftentimes have a built-in audience. Now, we have seen some performing arts acts kind of straddle the border here. So, we have seen some dance companies that utilize a lot of acrobatics. But if those artists self-identify as dancers and the application is worded that emphasizes their performance is dance and not acrobatics, then you generally are able to get through the decisions of the panelists quite easily. Now, we have had some folks who are storytellers that really straddle the line between stand-up comedy and storytelling. Again, it's really a combination, generally speaking, for the panelists about whether this artist identifies themselves as a performing artist or as more of an entertainment act. In other words, does that very humorous storyteller identify themselves as a very humorous storyteller, or do they identify themselves as a stand-up comedian? If it's the latter, then it's very difficult to get it awarded by the panelists. If it's the former, then you stand a better chance, particularly if you offer very strong argument in that way as well. Instead of emphasizing the comedic talents of that storyteller, emphasize their storytelling attributes. So, general rule of thumb is, if it's sort of on this borderline, in this gray area, reach out to us and allow us to read through your application, which we will offer to do. As long as you get it to us soon enough. We usually cut off that timing around 2 weeks prior to the deadline. But if you could get your application to us, we're happy to review it so that we can make any suggestions to ensure that it's getting through to the panelists. Another rule of thumb is that if it seems iffy and you have another project that is 100% clear cut, go for the clear cut projects. And this is true for a number of different projects in general, but particularly when it comes to some of these acts that are on this straddle the border between performing arts and entertainment. Another key eligibility requirement is that these artists must be touring from outside of the state. So if you are on the border of your state, that artist could cross the border within 100 feet and be eligible, just as much as someone who is traveling from thousands of miles away. So all we ask is that they cross the border. You can have artists from throughout the Western states. As long as they're crossing into your state, you could have artists that are, across the United States, or even international artists, and they would all be eligible. But if that artist is based within your state, unfortunately, that is ineligible. Secondly, the project components, which I'll talk a little bit more about. You have to have a public performance and an educational outreach. I already mentioned there's a strong emphasis on serving the needs of underserved communities, and that could refer to a number of different things. But I do believe that the panelists, generally speaking, will kind of award the most underserved. So if you have needs in multiple areas, as I described before, then that's always going to be scored a little bit more highly and given a little bit more clout than those that are perhaps just arts underserved, for example, as opposed to many different categories. As I mentioned, the organization must match the grant award from a one-to-one match with artistic fees. So that is a key component of the eligibility requirements as well. And it cannot count if it is in-kind funds either, if anyone is wondering. Before we move on, I just want to add one important thing. For those of you who are familiar with our partner organization, the Western Arts Alliance, the Western Arts Alliance launched in the past year the Advancing Indigenous Performance Touring Fund grant. What that is that if you as a presenter book an artist that self-identifies as an Indigenous person from the United States or its territories. So this also includes Pacific Islanders from Hawaii, Native Hawaiians, as well as Native Americans and Alaska Natives. If your organization books an Indigenous artist from the United States and its territories, you will see a place in the TourWest grant that asks that question: is your artist identify as Indigenous? If they do, please mark that as a yes. When these applications go through the panel, they will eventually be sent. Those ones marked as yes will be sent to WA, the Western Arts Alliance, to showcase that they are Indigenous identifying artists, and therefore the remainder of the artistic fees will be covered by WA. So what I'm saying is that if you book an Indigenous artist from the United States, you have the opportunity to receive an award that covers the entirety of the artistic fees. So that could be a really great boon to a lot of the presenters. Okay, sometimes contracts with artists don't break out travel costs and artistic fees. There is one lump sum that is meant to cover all of that. For the purposes of this grant, would we need to estimate fees versus travel? Sometimes it is true that there is a contract that doesn't break apart the travel costs and the artistic fees. You should estimate the fees versus the travel costs. I think that would be the most fair thing to do. Most of the time we do see contracts that do break the artistic fees out of all of the remaining costs. And so generally this is not an issue, or at least not one that we see very often. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but I know that many of the panelists will likely be a little bit confused if they see that the costs of the project are $5,000 and then in the application budget you say that the artistic fees are $3,000. You might want to write somewhere in there what the difference is, explaining that someplace in the narrative about that discrepancy, because I know there will be questions about it. Because their immediate thought would be like, if the fees are $5,000, then why do they only want $1,500? But you have estimated that the artistic fees are $3,000 and the most you're eligible for is $1,500. But generally speaking, we do like to see those artistic fees separated out from the rest of the costs of the project. And you will do that in the project budget anyway. So yeah, we already spoke a bit to this, but the components of the project, there must be at a minimum of two. And that is, the first is a requirement, is a public performance. So the public performance can be a ticketed show that's open to the general public. That's what it must be. Oftentimes, the public performance, or I guess in certain circumstances, a public performance may have free tickets. And that's okay, just as long as those tickets are offered to the general public. It can't just be free tickets given to students at the school where you have the outreach. That is not a public performance. That's not eligible. If the public performance is just for the families of the school children that you're doing the outreach with. The public performance is characterized by it being accessible to the general public. So sometimes it's helpful to think about what it's not. Other things that are ineligible for performances, as I mentioned, are like if it's only the staff, faculty, and families of the students where you do the outreach to. I will also kind of go back to some of the artists that are ineligible. So again, these sort of entertainment type performances, magic, stand-up comedy, acrobatics, etc. Seasonal performances that have a built-in audience, Broadway shows, just anything, think about that built-in audience. In addition to that, this is really key. Guest performances are also ineligible for the public performance. That is, if you bring in a guest conductor to play with your local symphony, that is not considered a presentation of an artist that crosses state lines. That is considered a guest artist, which is ineligible. Artists that are performing with some of the local artists in your community are also ineligible because that is kind of seen as a guest performance as well. Some examples of this include a lot of children's theater performances. So if you're looking at that, please very likely reach out to us, because oftentimes children's theater performances like to build their performances around teaching something to the youth in your community and having them perform it as part of the public performance. Now, if it's just one song that is coming out of the outreach, that's okay. But if it is an entire performance that includes local artists, local community members, local school children, etc., that is going to be an ineligible performance. So anything that is, by and large, a performance of your local community with an artist, whether it's professional artists in your community or not, that is going to be considered ineligible. Any performances that are part of a fundraiser similar to a conference, that is also ineligible. We cannot support fundraisers, first of all. And second of all, generally speaking, if a performance is part of a fundraiser, it almost always is limited to the ticket holders for that fundraiser, as opposed to open to the general audience. Of course, a couple of exceptions, as there almost always is, and that is a conference may be booking an artist that is coming from out of state, and that conference may also have a lot of associated educational outreach with that artist. If that is the case, that may be eligible if the artist is performing for the general public as opposed to only the conference goers. That's also true for a fundraiser. Like, you can have an associated fundraiser that is in and of itself its own event. But if the artist that you're booking to support that is performing for the general public outside of those fundraiser ticket holders, there can be an exception to that. If you have any questions about that, please do schedule time with us so that we could talk further about it and make sure that you are writing a very clear grant that clearly demonstrates that to our panelists. And then the second part of the TourWest project components are the educational outreach. So panelists are looking very highly at this component because this kind of touches a lot upon the underserved audience needs most often. It speaks to collaboration. So this is an important part of your application, in addition to it being a requirement. So educational outreach as part of TourWest can mean many different things. And you must have at least one outreach activity. That outreach must be educational in the broadest sense. So in other words, it doesn't have to have a strict curriculum. It does not need to be in a school necessarily, but it should be educational. And it should be conducted in collaboration with the artist. So those are kind of the key components of the educational outreach that we're looking for. Some examples of what it could look like are lectures or demonstrations for the community members. It could be artists performing at a senior home or a home for disabled folks. It could be a performance in school with associated activities, learning activities. It could be at community centers. If they're a performance in one of those sorts of places, it generally speaking should be a bit of a more interactive and intimate performance that is educational. Other examples can be master classes, open rehearsals where the artist is, kind of engaging with the folks that are attending. It really can be a number of things. And we have seen over the years more and more creative attention paid to this, where presenters are working with community associations, community groups, schools, and really kind of listening to their needs and working with the artists and learning about what their skill sets are and crafting a really unique project that is really highlighting the knowledge and skills of those artists, as well as really deeply connecting with their community members, particularly those that are most underserved. Other things to know about the educational outreach is that there's no requirement in terms of audience, in terms of how many folks are served by this outreach. We can define that very, in many ways. So sometimes it's most impactful when you have a huge audience where you're busing an entire school to see a performance, an interactive performance of this artist. Excuse me. Other times it can be really focused. And we just had a presenter actually in Montana speak to this, that they tried something new where it was more of a masterclass one-on-one with the artist at a community center, and they invited local musicians to learn from this artist. And they had very few people show up compared to what they expected, but it ended up being one of the most deeply moving educational outreaches that their organization had put together. So it could be a very deep class for a handful of people. It could be very focused. It could be, there is no requirement in terms of audience. We just hope that it's impactful, relevant, and educational. Some other things to know about the educational outreach is that panelists, as I mentioned, perhaps really like to know that it is most relevant to your community and most relevant to the artist's expertise, as well as most relevant to kind of your mission and the underserved element. So the better you could tie that together is also helpful. It's also helpful to kind of explain exactly what's going to happen. But most importantly, outreach must be separate from the public performance. We do expect and hope even that there's going to be overlap in the audience. However, if you're trying to capture the exact same audience because you had a public performance and immediately after you had a lecture and demonstration with the artist, that's not what we're looking for. We're looking to have an engagement that serves an even broader or maybe a more focused element of your audience, but that it's not the exact same audience that shows up for the public performance. And then just kind of reminders of how to apply. So again, the application is at tourwest.gosmart.org. As we mentioned, over the past couple of years, we've been trying really hard to ensure that the page itself is much more helpful to you. You will find some frequently asked questions, many of which I addressed here. You will find deeper explanations of eligibility requirements. If there's anything that I didn't answer here, you have some confusion on, you can reach out to us again. When you log in and or create your login, first you will go to your profile page and fill that out if you haven't already. Do make sure that everything is correct under the profile page, because that is where we contact you, we send your checks, etc. And then you will be able to find under the tab Current Programs and Applications. That is where you will find the application page to begin filling out your TourWest 2020 grant application. And you can apply for 2 different projects each year, and you can receive 2. So if you have 2 eligible projects, I would encourage you to apply for 2 different projects. So that said, we hope that you will recognize that there is some overlapping information about your organization, about your community, etc. But be mindful to not just copy and paste. Be mindful to ensure that when you are creating your second application, that it is unique to that project, because panelists don't appreciate when it is a very copy and paste situation. Also, do be mindful that if you are utilizing or creating 2 applications, that it's important that you don't mix up the information in them. So please always check your work. But as we mentioned before, some of these sorts of issues, these technical information, FAQs, as well as pro tips, that we will be going over that in our second webinar series. We just found that there was just too much to go over in one. And so that's really to help you to answer some of the deeper questions and to help you write a great grant application. So we did want to spend some time on this, answering your question. I will quickly add one thing that I missed before I open it up to questions. When we are talking about artistic merit and we are talking about the argument you should make for the merit of the artist in your grant narrative, another key place to showcase the merit of the artist is in the work samples. So please do be sure that you get some high quality work samples to attach to your application from the artist or their agent or management. Be sure to try to get that as soon as possible. We need the original files. We cannot use YouTube links. If it is a dance company, a theater company, etc., audio recordings are going to be difficult. We encourage video recordings. If it's a musician, certainly you can only use audio recordings if you would like, but video recordings always do help the panelists get an understanding of how they engage with the audience. So please do think of high quality live examples, 2 1-minute clips on that. If you have additional questions on that, please join us for the second session and or listen to the recording of it or reach out to us. Before I open it up to questions, I just want to reiterate that we are here to help you. Please reach out to Lonnie. I will be supporting her on that. We are happy to schedule time to make calls with you all. We will be posting this webinar online so that if you want to review it, you can. We are willing and able to read through your grant applications and offer any suggestions. And most importantly, if you have some very specific questions that are not answered in our website, are not answered in our webinars, there's a good chance that you should probably reach out to us so that we could help you with some of those nuances. So please don't hesitate to do that over email or over the phone. We're happy to take your calls, answer your questions. And with that, let me answer any of your questions. Feel free to chat into the chat box and I can answer those questions. Similarly, if we're not speaking over each other, you can also unmute yourself. When is part 2? So the next webinar, I think we don't start, and Lonnie, you can help me too. The second webinar, I don't believe starts until the second week of March. Is that correct, Lonnie?
That's correct.
I'm sorry. Okay, great. Yeah, I'm trying to check my calendar at the same time.
March 10th.
So, March 10th is the first one, and or only session of the second one?
March 24th. Awesome.
Okay, so we have 2 of the second parts. We will also, for those of you who have colleagues that want to participate in one of these webinars, we'll be doing another of the first part as well, of this goals and eligibility. Let's see. If there are additional ineligible events as part of the artist's visit, a dinner with donors, a pre-concert talk, etc., should these be left off completely? That's a great question. And I feel like it's really kind of at your discretion. I don't think it's a requirement to leave it off, but I do think that you should not emphasize them. I will say that depending on how depending on what your contract looks like, as well as how your narrative is how it reads, there can be some big questions from the panelists. So for example, if you have a contract that mentions all of these additional engagements, but you don't talk about it at all in the narrative, I know that the panelists will probably have a lot of questions and be somewhat wary, and your funding could be affected by that. Similarly, if you do mention it in the narrative and you kind of overemphasize it, or you speak about it in a very vague way, that could also confuse the panelists, and they will have questions around what is it exactly that we're funding. So we do try to really parse it and make sure that the eligible aspects are there. But there are times that, grant applicants are just not clear about that, and there's a lot of confusion, and that can affect funding. So my recommendation for those of you who have additional components to your project, as was mentioned, please reach out to us. Let us read through that grant application so that we can make sure that it'll be clear to the panelists. And that's always a good recommendation, but especially for something like that. Okay, another question from Claire West. Want to make sure that you don't have to complete a whole separate application for the Indigenous Artists Initiative. Thank you, Claire. That's a great question. You do not need to complete a second application, which is why if anybody is booking an Indigenous artist from the United States and its territories, I would highly recommend you do that because it's super simple. What happens is that you fill out your TourWest grant application. There will be a little radio box with a question that says, does your artist identify as Indigenous, Pacific Islander, Hawaiian Native, something to that effect. So in other words, they must be self-identify as Indigenous and living in the United States and its territories. So all you do is check that box as a yes, tell us about the project, and then when we have gone through the panel, we send those applications. We send those applications to WA, the Western Arts Alliance, and then they confirm that they're eligible on their end. And if they are, then they match those funds. It's as easy as that. The only time that we ran into an issue last year was because the Indigenous artist actually resided in Canada. And so there was a little bit of confusion there. It was an Indigenous artist, but they were not living in the United States. So related to that, Indigenous artists need to be out of state, Native Hawaiians from continental US. So the Indigenous artist still should be crossing state boundaries to perform at your venue. But that said, okay, I could be mistaken on this because we do not administer this grant, and Lonnie and I could get final information. But for example, if it's a Native Hawaiian artist that's living in Las Vegas, Nevada, that counts. If it is a Paiute artist that's living in Hawaii, that also counts. I believe so, and this is where I think it gets a little shady, but I'm almost certain that this is correct. I'm not 100% certain. But if you had someone from one of the First Nations in Canada, but that resides in the United States and has done so for some time, I also believe that counts. I also believe it counts, like if you are you're Maori, Indigenous New Zealander, and you live in the United States. I also believe that counts, but I am not 100% certain on those instances. I do know that any Indigenous peoples indigenous to Hawaii, Alaska, and the continental United States do count. I also believe it counts for Guam and Puerto Rico. Lonnie, can you find the link to that grant information and put it in the comments, please?
Yes, give me 1 second.
Sure. And so you can find more information at WA's site. I apologize for not having those clear answers off the top of my head, but you could also reach out to Ed Bourgeois at WA, and then they have a page as well. But it's super easy for you to do it, and I highly encourage you to do it if you are already looking to book an Indigenous artist. It is 2 o'clock. Do we have any other super quick questions? And before you all hang up, Lonnie will put that information into the Slack. There you go. So in the chat function here, Lonnie has put a link to the Advancing Indigenous Performance grant information from WA. And again, if we don't have any last questions, those were all really great. Please do reach out to us. TourWest at WESTAF.org. I'm actually going to correct this last slide. It says my info, which is true. And that's our phone number. You could reach Lonnie or I at that phone number at WESTAF 303-629-1166. But I'm going to slack into here the best email for us because I will be out of the office for the next 2 weeks, as well as Lonnie is now the grants manager, so it's best to reach out to her. So it's TourWest at weststaff.org for all of your TourWest questions. Again, you can call it 303-629-1166 and ask for Lonnie or someone that can help with your TourWest question. Both of us will be around more or less to assist you. I mean, Lonnie will be there all the time, and I will be in and out assisting her to help you. So thank you all again for your time. Please reach out to us with any additional questions, and hopefully you will join us for the next webinar as well if you have the time. And if you don't, we encourage you to view that webinar online once it's up. Thanks again, and good luck with your applications. It is never too early to get started. Thank you.